Dennis Berardi is the visual effects supervisor on Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities. I'm Matt Noble of Gold Derby, and I want to start, Dennis, by asking you, what was the scariest thing to do the visual effects for?
Probably for you mean in the whole anthology?
Yeah, in the whole anthology, what was the scariest thing you had to design or work on?
Um, Probably the most challenging one, I think, was there was a lot because it was an anthology of curated by Guillermo with eight really strong directors who had a strong vision, and and there was a signature kind of a look and feel for every effect. But I think probably the Pickman's model episode where we had the ghoul, that is, coming out from another dimension, um, you know, and figuring that design out, and then how to shoot, how, the design. We created a puppet for it, a half scale puppet, so shooting at forced perspective was a lot of fun and interesting, old school, you know, cinematography techniques with forced perspective, and then doing a digital version of it as well with and then fully animating it as well in instances where because Guillermo always likes to kind of lean into the best of both worlds. I'll do as much in camera as possible, but then enhance it or take it over digitally also where possible. So that was probably the hardest one to figure out, followed by a close second would be our blob monster in the viewing with Panos Cosmatos directing that episode. And again, big design challenges there, and also technical challenges in terms of how to shoot this blob monster. And then also we had to do a big transformation from literally, cracking open this orb, this obelisk, alien obelisk, and this oozing sort of stuff that turns into the monster was also a big challenge. So those two are probably the biggest ones that we had in terms of visual effects challenges on the creature side.
You talked about how Guillermo likes to combine the old school and new school visual effects, and like obviously technology has come. We've got so much at our disposal with technology and what we can do with that. Des, what is the strength to the old school techniques in horror?
I mean, the strength is, I mean, it's myriad. The benefits. I mean, it gives us all on set something to light to compose to. It gives the actors something to play off of for everything from eye lines. It gives a cinematographer, you know, something to light, and then and we all come together on set, and Guillermo and Miles assembled, an A-list team, the team that's been working together, well, probably for now a couple decades. Um, Including myself, which is great. And the philosophy, and Guillermo's philosophy is always, how do we achieve this in camera? And he doesn't, just default easily to, well, we can't do it. It's got to be digital. We do try to do it practically in camera. And so in the case, let's say of the viewing, that big obelisk in the center of the room, that was a real build that art department built. Lovely, beautifully art directed, beautifully lit. Panos wanted to use vintage anamorphic lenses. Now you're starting to get all that texture, and then when we start to take it over and it starts to crack apart, we take that over and that becomes digital. But I've got all the practical elements working with the atmosphere and the beautiful backlighting and the texture, and it gives us something to match into or take over. So it's so important. I think the best visual effect is an in-camera visual effect, and the second best visual effect is a digital visual effect. And I think maybe, you know, the best way to do it is to try it in camera, and only go to digital if it's not working, and then ultimately take it over or go digital if and as you have to. And that was the philosophy here on this whole show. And I think that's why, anything that Guillermo does, and I worked with him on Nightmare Alley and Shape of Water and Crimson Peak, and other shows like, multiple series, seasons of The Strain, for example, even on a series episodic budget, that's always our methodology. And I think the audience, I think if we break the suspension of disbelief, we're guilty. We've not done our jobs. And I think getting something in camera, and at least starting with it in camera, I think we earn the visual effect, digital enhancement when we're and that idea of an audience not really knowing how it's done. Oh, is that digital? Is that practical? Is that in camera? Is that a miniature? Is that a puppet? And because everybody's so savvy, and so we just use all of the techniques all of the time, and and kind of like I think the audience goes along for the ride. And I think on certain shows, and I think you know what I'm talking about, where if it's just all CGI all the time, it's just it's tinny, or it's just it's just you're not into it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and it like might look really good at the time, but when it's all digital effects, it does sometimes tend to date more quickly as well as the technology improves and it gets replaced by better technology. Then you compare it to, oh boy, like technology's come a long way since
I
that
agree.
thing. But usually puppetry and builds can last a lot longer in terms of their shelf life.
I totally agree if they're done right.
Yes. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. I guess if you do it badly, they'll date pretty quickly too. Um,
Yeah,
you did talk about like we did old school practical effects. Does that mean you have to collaborate more with other departments, and how does that like sort of maybe enhance sort of a sense of and spirit of community in making the
absolutely. I mean, absolutely. It's very collegial on a Guillermo set. I mean, we are working with the special effects makeup people from an early stage, of course, art department in terms of the sets, um, stunts. Um, the cinematographer always, our DP is a real partner in this. And in the case of, again, to the viewing, or in the case of the Ghoul, the two examples I pointed out, which were particular challenges, we also had, spectral motion involved on the show. And they're a great creature effects animatronics company. And on that, as I say, on the Ghoul, we did a half scale uh, version of the Ghoul. So the Ghoul that we shot on set was basically 3 feet tall, 36 inches tall. And what we did is we filmed a 6 foot person as a stand-in for the Ghoul in kind of a gray suit, and we staged the action as directly as Keith, our director, wanted it. Keith Thomas, and approved by Guillermo. And once we had that, we went to a blue screen stage and we puppeteered the Ghoul in a forced perspective lineup, where we kind of worked with frame rate and the lensing to aggrandize this puppet to fit into the plates. And it was, everybody was involved, like the whole up and down the gamut. It wasn't one of those just let's do it in post. And I think the effort, I think it shows. I think the effort really shows. I think that Ghoul feels big, and it feels real, and it feels like something otherworldly. It feels textured. And it's part puppet and part CG. Some shots are all puppet, some shots are all CG, and some shots are a combination of both, where we replace a little bit of the face or some of the hands for grabbing and stuff like that. And I like approaching visual effects that way, where in camera effects, and we were doing all kinds of things, playing with reverse motion, under cranking, over cranking, different types of lensing, force perspective with, staging things closer to camera and other things further away from camera to, all kinds of things like that. And then the CG came in. There were a lot of visual effects. I mean, we were about 1,500 visual effects shots across the 8 episodes. So there's a lot of visual effects, as you can probably tell. Well, I hope you're not able to see where the practical begins and the visual effects
mm,
start. What I mean to say, it's a very visual
mm,
experience across the episodes.
yeah, there's ghouls and aliens and all that sort of stuff. What, Dennis? What is with what do you, because there's obviously things like ghouls where people are going to be thinking, oh, there's probably some visual effects at work there. What's something that you did that people might not think in a million years is a visual effect that you worked on the series?
Well, if you look at some of the stuff that's in maybe a more grounded episode, like the murmuring, the Jennifer Kent episode, which is a lovely episode, one of my favorites, very emotional episode. It's a story about grief and loss and how you can come back from that in relationships. I'm not sure if you've seen that episode. And that's there are a couple of ornithologists. They're struggling with the death of a child, and the natural surroundings kind of reflect what's happening with them emotionally. And so we were doing all these birds, these murmurations of birds, and we looked at a lot of reference. They were dunlins, these types of birds that exhibit this kind of like very peculiar flocking behavior. It almost looks like they have a unified consciousness when they fly through the air. And we hired ornithologists to help us. We shot hours and hours and hours of footage of real birds, and then we ultimately went digital with most of the birds. And my hope is that everyone, like, they just see the birds as what they are, just they're in nature, they're there, and hopefully that, I hope if we did our jobs right, you believe it. And I think we did in that instance. And it was based on research and looking at nature and how these birds move. We had close-up shots of birds as well, and those were digital as well. Not in most cases they were digital. So I'm pretty happy with that, and I hope that people are like, wow, that was really, I know that I've done my job when the visual effects really support the story and take the viewer on an emotional ride, and we don't again break that suspension of disbelief or take someone out of it when the journey is supposed to be quite emotional, like in the case of the murmuring. In that case, that kind of an episode is somewhat harder to do than just getting scares. I mean, probably one of the funnest episodes we did was Lot 36 with Guillermo Navarro directing, where we had this crazy wraith monster creature with these tentacles all over the place. And that was great fun for us and the animators to do that one as well. But so to give you a range of something that's more naturalistic
Mm.
and wants to be 100% integrated, and something that's a bit more, let's say, showy and a bit more in your face, and design more for the horror of it.
Mm. You've mentioned you've worked with Guillermo before on projects, including The Shape of Water, which he won, Best Picture and Best Director for. What for you is what is your favorite thing about telling stories with Guillermo?
I mean, the favorite thing for me is that he challenges me to reach new heights. I've improved as a filmmaker myself and as an artist, as a manager, as a communicator, um, because Guillermo has pushed us to do our best, to bring our best. And in the case of Shape of Water, I mean, there's another example of, everyone firing together on all cylinders. We had Doug Jones as a performer, as a creature. We had Mike Hill with the makeup effects, which was amazing. Um, Dan Lauschten lighting. I mean, it was an all-star team. And then there's me. I better bring my A game when that team is involved. And Guillermo's always pushing for better and better and better, and the moments are very designed. And so I like what he brings out of us as artists. He really challenges us, and you don't often have the opportunity. The other thing is that he's got a great vision, and he's a great designer, and he can sketch something up and say, like, this is what I want. But then he's also a great listener, so you kind of get the best of both worlds. And so that's kind of my favorite. His process, let's just say, his creative process is very challenging, but it's very, like, we can all contribute. It's very, very rewarding. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And you, as a visual effects supervisor, what's the most important thing for you in making good visual effects for film or television?
For me, it's all about, well, it starts with the scripted page, but beyond that, it really is about preparing and testing and R&D. And you can't really just show up on the day and expect to shoot something and it's going to work out okay if it's an important story driven visual effect. So, weeks and weeks and weeks of prep, of testing, of design, ideally, a camera test or two. And I've set my own green screen up here in my studio. I have motion capture here. We we can shoot little things with our own camera setup as well. And for me, it's all about prep and kind of like rapid prototyping, and then being ready on the day to shoot it, and then owning it in post production. So, you know, especially at the level that we're operating with directors like Guillermo, for me, it's all about designing it, prepping it, testing it, knowing where the problems lie. And like in the case again of in the viewing where he had to melt, this alien force starts shooting out these pulses of microwave energy, and we have to start melting everybody. So we we did a dry run on wax heads. We different concoctions of wax heads, and we melted them, and we found that with heat guns and blow, like all these heat sources on these things take like 15 minutes to melt. So we learned that in a camera test way before we went to camera for real for principal photography. And it actually ended up being, yes, about a 10-minute time lapse shoot before we got the melting effect, and then we sped it up in post and augmented in CG and stuff like that. If we didn't test it, I think it would have been a disaster on the day with a crew and whatnot. So for me, it's the most important thing to answer your question is just prepping and making mistakes early so that you can really, on the day get the elements that you need and set yourself up for a success in post production.
Mm. And to finish off, Dennis, in Cabinet of Curiosities, what were you the most curious about as you approached the project?
Uh, it was funny because when Miles and Guillermo first pitched it to me, that Guillermo wanted to do an anthology. There were a bunch of different stories that they were talking about. Some of them were original stories that Guillermo just thought up. There was a few Lovecraft stories. Panos was going to do an original script. So I was really curious about about Guillermo's ultimate curating. I mean, he chose the director and chose the stories. And so when it all started to come together, um, there's a lot of anticipation amongst the department heads about what the ultimate, who the directors were going to be and what the stories were going to be. And when Guillermo revealed them to us, it was it's pretty exciting.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much for talking with us today. All the best of luck for the Emmy Awards for Cabinet of
Oh, thank
Curiosities
you.
that's coming up. And people watching this interview can go to goldderby.com to follow our awards coverage. Dennis, really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thank you.